first. Yai dai, yai da dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Hi dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to everyone out there in the Zoomagog. Glad you are here with us. I'm so delighted to welcome Rabbi Art Green. Can you hear me okay? Is the sound coming through out there in Zoom? You'll let us know if you need anything. I woke up this morning thinking that a bracha was in order for today, and I was thinking about what the appropriate bracha would be for me. And I know that there is a blessing for seeing a great Torah scholar, and there's some halachic debate about whether you're allowed to say this bracha anymore. And I forgot to ask you if maybe it would make you uncomfortable if we said this bracha for seeing a great Torah scholar, which some say really we don't say anymore. So, but the bracha that I wanted to say for this moment is, so there's a discussion in the Talmud that what do you say if you see someone that you haven't seen for more than a year, right? And many of us have had the opportunity to say this blessing. I know it's been well over a year since you've last been to Berkeley. You've been here some years ago. And the blessing that you say is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam mechayei hametim. Blessed are you, God, you give life to the dead. But I wanted to share the teaching. Not only is the blessing saying thank you, God, that the person that you haven't seen for a long time isn't dead, which certainly is significant, having lived through a pandemic. But Likutei Halachot, I learned recently, the teaching of Rabbi Nachman's student, Reb Nassim, correct, is that the reason why we say this blessing is when we see someone that we haven't seen for a while, we feel our owed aliveness. We feel our aliveness. And so we are blessing, thank God, not just that the person isn't dead, but thank God for giving us this feeling of aliveness that we have in seeing this person. So that's the blessing that I want to say. It is so wonderful to have you here with us. I know reading your book in preparation for today, I felt my aliveness in your teachings. So just, I'll stop talking in just a second, but a quick bio. For those that might not know, Rabbi Dr. Art Green was the founding dean and currently rector of the Rabbinical School at Hebrew College. He is a historian of Jewish religion and a theologian. He was educated at Brandeis University and the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he received rabbinic ordination. He's taught Jewish mysticism, Hasidism, and theology to several generations of students at the University of Pennsylvania, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, where he served as both dean and president, Brandeis, and now at Hebrew College, and has taught and lectured widely throughout the Jewish community of North America, as well as in Israel. He was the founder of Chavarat Shalom in Massachusetts in 1968, and is the author of many wonderful books, some of which I have here, on Jewish mysticism, theology, spirituality, as well as a translator of Hasidic texts. You continue to be very prolific. You've had a busy decade. I understand you recently turned 80, but not slowing down at all. You've got new projects coming up as well. And we have two of your recent books here, Judaism for the World won the National Jewish Book Award, and your new translation of the Maorei Naim. Just a little bit about the format for today. When I asked you a couple weeks ago to give me a blurb for your talk and a title, and you said, just read my book and ask me questions. So you gave me quite the assignment. I've been hard at work. You can see all of my little notes and stickies. So it's going to be some questions and discussion. And I just want to say one thing personally before I let you start talking. Your book, I want to show you your translation and commentary on the Sfat Emet, the language of truth, the Torah commentary of Rabbi Yehuda Leib Alter Ger, was, I think, the first Hasidic sefer that I owned. I got this at Westside Judaica in the late 90s. You can see it's completely fallen apart. And this is not a commentary on the quality of the book binding. It is 100% a commentary on how much I have used this book, among many others of yours, over the years for teaching, for learning. Before I had the ability, to go into a store and buy the one with the burgundy cover and the gold letters, you opened up for me Hasidic texts in a way that has profoundly influenced my spirituality, my rabbinate, the teaching that I do. And I know that I am far from alone in that. So I just want to say a personal word of thank you to you for your scholarship and your Torah that has truly profoundly impacted the Jewish world in so many ways. So it is a blessing and honor to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful to be here. First of all, it's wonderful to be in a place where they, like us, start with a nigun. That's always very nice. It tells you something about the quality of what we want to create together. And you write books, you don't know who's reading them out there. I'm delighted to know that you take it all so seriously and it's been so important to you. And you use that Sfat Emet exactly the way I wanted you to have the English text and then the Hebrew text, and then be able to graduate from that book and go to the original. So I couldn't be more delighted to hear that.
Yes, all your books, I brought a few of them here, are just filled with highlighted parts and stickers and all kinds of things. So, all right, let's talk about your new book. 2020 came out, Judaism for the World. I just want to start with some basics before we go deeper. So we're all on the same page. So much of your career has been bringing Hasidic teachings to the non-Hasidic world. What drew you to Hasidic texts? What continues to draw you to Hasidic texts? What in them is important for us today? And you described your approach as neo-Hasidic. So for those that might not be as familiar with Hasidut, can you talk about the difference between Hasidism and neo-Hasidism?
Okay, we can spend an hour and a half on that, and then we'll go on from there.
No, I spent a lot of time preparing, so we have other questions to get to.
I was attracted to Hasidism very young. I was 20 years old. In those days, I would write the date as well as my name inside books when I got them. And my copy of Sefer Baal Shem Tov says 1959, says Tashiat. So I know when I got my first Hasidic books, I was 19 or 20. I came from a secular American Jewish family. I had been through a very intense Orthodox period from ages 12 or 13 to 18, and then walked away from it totally and tried to be a secular Jew. And my way back into Judaism was discovering Hasidism. Discovering Hasidism because somebody gave me an essay by Hillel Zeitlin to read when I was 20, which I loved, and sort of said, yes, this is my language. I had met Zalman Schachter already. He came around and I was an undergraduate at Brandeis, needed a couple of Shabbatonim at Brandeis. That had a big effect on me. I was reading Buber and I had read Heschel when I was a teenager. And so it was all it sort of came through those channels. And I just felt that Hasidism as a philosophy was a way back to Judaism for you. It wasn't about becoming Orthodox again. I was far from that at that point. But it had an abstract kind of theology. It was about being in nothingness and oneness and a sort of pantheistic vision that I really loved. I had given up on the old fellow in the sky kind of religion and the religion of excessive guilt and so on, the typical adolescent obsessive thing. And I was looking for another kind of Judaism, and Hasidism provided that language for me. I was on the college campus. I graduated college in '61. In those days, Dr. Suzuki was coming around and beginning to talk about Zen Buddhism, and people were interested in Eastern spirituality. And for me, that became Hasidism. I should also say that I was trained to be an academic. I was trained to be a scholar. All right, you want to study the history of Jewish mysticism in the Middle Ages down through Hasidism, that's fine. I was not trained to be a theologian. That happened to me later in life. I was trained to be a presenter of Hasidism, including translating Hasidic texts. I had great mentors. All my teachers. I was an American Jewish kid, just the right age to learn from all the great survivors who had come to America just before and just after the war. My teachers were all East European Jews trained in Germany. Nachum Glatzer, Alexander Altman, Abraham Joshua Heschel. These were the sort of people at whose feet I learned. And they also believed in presenting the text to people. Glatzer was a great anthologizer, presenting text in English. So I felt that was part of my job and fell in love with doing that.
Thank you. You used the word panentheism, I believe, and I'm not sure everybody knows what that word means. So I'll ask you to come back to it. Let me just put it in a bigger question. Let's just go right there and talk about God, okay? So you use the expression in your book, Judaism for Adults, and you write and teach exquisitely about a non-dualistic approach to God. Even just the word God gives some people an allergic reaction. So I just want to say that in using the word. But you talk about a God who isn't out there, but a God is being, or God is all there is. So could you first of all, define the word panentheism and talk about why you think this idea of God is so needed for seekers today?
Yes. All of us, more or less, as adults, have outgrown the childish concept of God we had. As I said, the fellow in the sky who punishes the bad children and rewards the good children. And then at some point, whether it was 11 or 13 or 21, we discovered that's not the case. The world isn't constructed that way. And then what do? And most Jews, I must say, give up on Judaism because they've never been given a more mature approach to what faith is, to what it means to be a religious person. They think that's what Judaism is. And once that's out the window, then the whole thing is out the window. It becomes a kind of projected father figure rebellion. And I got beyond that, and that's very important to me. Panentheism means God is one with all things, is present in everything, but also is a mystery beyond that we can't possibly ever know. We can't possibly ever penetrate it. Pantheism, as defined by Spinoza, means God is equivalent to the totality of all being, all things that exist. But some people say that's spiritual, and some people say that's reductionist, because God is nature, nature is God, there is nothing beyond nature. And so panentheism means there is always a mystery beyond. We never quite know what the totality of being is. I have no real interest in the English word God. It comes, after all, from the Norse, from old Germanic languages, and it referred to the gods, the ancient Norse gods. But the Hebrew word Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is an impossible conflation of the verb to be. If you know a bit of Hebrew, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is Haya, Hoveh, Yeh, is, was, will be, all smushed together in a form that doesn't really exist. And you have God. So really, I would rather translate it is, was, will be than God. It is the totality of being. And therefore we are part of it. And it is within us and we are within it. And there is no ultimate separation between reality and divinity. And that's the kind of religion I live with, and the kind of religion I don't expect. I don't believe in or expect a God who controls events as they happen, who is the arbiter of reward and punishment and so on. But I know a divinity that is present in all things, that we can open our eyes to, that we can discover in life. And that has been the great reward of my life, to live in that in the presence of that discovery. Something like that.
Beautiful. Let me just check and make sure. Is the sound coming through okay, Emma, for the people on Zoom? Yep. Okay, great.
Fine.
Good. So I completely, what you just said completely resonates with me. And at the same time, our texts and our Siddur are completely filled with a personal God image and anthropomorphic descriptions of God and so on. You write in your book about the value of the personal God for its moral power, the God in which we are created in that image. So could you talk about how we hold both of those, both this panentheistic God that is being, that is, was, will be, and the God of the Siddur, that's Avinu Malkeinu and Baruch Atah. And so how do we hold both of those?
With great difficulty. How about that for the start of an answer? Among the things I'm still writing, I have written over the past 20 years a commentary on the Siddur, which is a bridge between my own theology and what the Siddur says. That's going to be published next year by Hebrew College and IJS, Institute for Jewish Spirituality, and I hope copies of it will get there so you can see the Siddur and how I read it. But that's, I mean, you've asked the $64,000 question, so to speak. Why, if you have this kind of belief, do you stick with this tradition that's so rooted in this fellow in the sky? And the answer is, it's mine and I love it and it has worked for me. But I have to tell you something about how it's worked for me. I understand that all our images of God are human projections. If we see God as king, that's a projection from human kingship. If we see God as father, that's a projection of human parenthood. But if we see God as a lake or a river, that's a projection from our experiences of lakes and rivers and suns and moons and everything else. Every way we see the divine is a projection from some human experience, because we have limited minds. That's who we are. We have only our experience to build on. Why do we project those God figures? I have a sense we project them because we sense within us that there is some deeper mystery and we want to relate to it. And we don't know how to say, I love you to the oneness of the universe. We don't know how to say, I stand in your presence to the great mystery of life. So we project a God figure. I like to say, I said it, and then I discovered Hillel Zeitlin had said it many years before me. God creates us in the divine image and we are obliged to return the favor. Or we create God in our likeness because we have some inherent sense that God created us in a divine likeness. And in groping toward that, we need some figure to hold on to. And so we project our images of God. But it doesn't mean they're true in any kind of literal way. They are our way of coming toward the mystery. The personal God, I like to say, is a bridge between the person and the mystery. It's a way we can get there. Now, for some people, it cuts off the mystery. It clogs the way, and then it's not functioning well. That's what happened to me as an adolescent. And I had to walk away from it totally, because you get this fellow in the sky, you get this projected figure, and you take him too seriously, or him or her too seriously. If you want to do a female God, the mother can also serve that way. And then you have to, as the Buddhists say, kill the Buddha, or wash yourself away from it in order to come back in a deeper way. Mm-hmm. But that's the fate of images. I don't think we can live without images.
Right. Something I've heard you say before, and you mentioned it in your book as well. You use the image of a hall of mirrors that can be approached from either end, yes, in terms of our projection onto what God is and God creating us in God's image. It's such a gorgeous image. Will you just say a little bit more about that?
A hall of mirrors that can be opened from either end. Are we in God's image? Is God in our image? Are we reflecting the one? Is the one a reflection of us? Who knows? Who knows? Hall of mirrors that can be opened from either side. You picture a kaleidoscope or something like that you can open from either end, that works from either end, and you play with that. I want to share with you something that I heard from Heschel. One of the great privileges of my life, of course, was being a private student of Abraham Joshua Heschel for 4 years. I was ready to quit rabbinical school after a year, and they said, "Would you stay if you could study privately with Heschel?" And I agreed.
I went to JTS, I understand.
Yes, you do, we all do. And I once heard Heschel say, "Why is the Torah so concerned with graven images? Why a graven image is such a big problem that it should be the second commandment, the first negative commandment. He said, if you ask Maimonides would say it's because God has no image. But so what? That's a theological error. Why should the Torah be so concerned with this theological error? He says, no, it's not because God has no image. God has an image, and that image is you. But the only medium in which you can make the image of God is the medium of your entire life. To take anything less than a full, living, breathing human being, like a piece of marble or a canvas, and try to make that the image of God, that lessens, that diminishes the divine self. That's lema'et tadmut, and that's idolatry. So you can't make the image of God, you can only be the image of God. So the idea of the divine image is very important to the moral teachings of Judaism, that every human being is a divine image is something that we really need to teach the world. It's one of the reasons I think Judaism exists. And if you don't have images, then you lose that. So I think we need to have, that's a part of what we need to preserve.
Beautiful, thank you. I'm going to talk about prayer a little bit. I'm a congregational rabbi that thinks a lot about prayer experiences. So you tell a great story in your book, Judaism for the World, about a debate between two young Hasidic masters-to-be, Menachem Nachum, who will become the Maggid of Chernobyl, the Moreh Naim, and Levi Yitzchak, who will later become Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. And in their conversation, Menachem Nachum is saying prayer should give us great pleasure, like food or sex, right? It should be very pleasurable.
The greatest of all pleasures.
The greatest of all pleasures. And Levi Yitzchak says, no, according to the way you tell it, if you're seeking pleasure, you're worshiping yourself and your own desire.
Spiritual masturbation, in other words.
Ooh, wow. Okay, so this reminded me of a story when I was in Machon Shechter in Israel. I had a professor named Moshe Benovitz, and he had grown up Orthodox, and he told the story of the first, I don't know if it was the first time, but he was walking home from shul with a group of other people that had gone to this conservative service together, and someone said to him, how did you enjoy services? And he said it was the first time that anyone had ever said, how did you enjoy services? Where he came from, you don't enjoy services, you daven, you go to shul because that's what you do. And that question stuck with me, that we think about, do you enjoy services? There's a lot of other things people could be doing on a Saturday morning than coming to shul.
So even say seems strange in Hebrew. It doesn't work.
Right. So my question for you is, so in this story that you tell, how did they resolve the machloket between these two masters in training? How did the story end? And what wisdom do you think this story offers for those of us that are involved in creating prayer experiences?
Well,
should we enjoy prayer? Should we make it pleasurable?
I'll start with this and then I'll go back to the question of prayer more generally. But they debated that fiercely. And you have the Chernobyl book. My book on Levi Yitzchak is coming out next year. And he takes the opposite position. No, it's not that devotion is the greatest pleasure. If you're doing it for pleasure, that's not good. You're there to give God pleasure. You should be pleasing God, not pleasing yourself. And devotion should be purely an act of giving. The fact that you get something out of it is not what it's about. Now think about this. I don't know if any of you do yoga or meditation, but it's exactly the same thing. Your meditation teachers will tell you, oh yes, it will be good for you. It will calm you down. Some people try to sell meditation to corporations. It will make people better workers. That's not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be an act of selflessness and giving and opening your heart. And opening your heart so that you will be more giving to others and more loving. The idea that you will get some benefit from it is not what it's supposed to be about. So this question of what's in it for me, what is it good for me, and in what way is it good for me, and how will I measure how good it is for me, then you don't understand what the devotional life is. Religion is about devotion, and that means being present and giving. Being present, becoming more open, and becoming more giving. The great Kabbalist of the 20th century, Rabbi Ashlag, unfortunately, he was badly brutalized by the Kabbalah Center version of his teaching. But he used to say, it's all of us in the world are mikablim. All of us are receivers. We receive the blessing of life in every moment. Everything is a gift. Believe me, when you turn 80, you know it more that every day is a gift. And the purpose of Kabbalah is to make us givers, not just receivers. Turn us into mashpiyim instead of just mikablim. To turn yourself into a giver, which means to make yourself more open and giving and generous. And that's what's in it for you. And that's what's in it for the world. And that's what's in it for God. And so that's the argument. That's the argument. But I want to go back and say in that same chapter on Tefillah, if you ask me my approach to prayer, I talk there about what prayer isn't and what prayer is, just for a moment. To explain to you what prayer isn't, I tell a story of a chassid who lives in New York and who's been running around all day doing business. And it's about 6 o'clock in the evening. He's in Grand Central Station, and it's probably mid-spring or mid-fall. He suddenly realizes, oh my God, I didn't daven mincha yet. And the time is almost up because the sun is set. And he said, I'm too embarrassed just to stand here in the middle of Grand Central Station and daven mincha. He looks around, he sees all these people with phones in their hands. He takes out his phone and says, and who's going to know? What prayer isn't? What prayer isn't is the question, is there anybody on the other end of the line? That's what prayer isn't. Because if you say there's nobody on the other end of the line, you would say the guy's crazy. He's talking into his phone and nobody's listening. That's what prayer isn't. It's not about, is there somebody up there listening? What prayer is, the contrast to that, I found in the teachings of one of the Hasidic masters when I first started working on this. The very first book I did was called Your Word is Fire, the Hasidic Masters on Contemplative Prayer. And my very favorite was one line from Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, which I always quote. I'll quote it in Hebrew for those who know, and I'll translate it. He says, Ha'olam svurin shemitpalelin lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu ve'eno ken. People think you pray to God, and that's not true. Ela hatfilah hi etzem Elohut mamash. But prayer itself is of the divine essence. God is present in prayer, not over there at the other end of the phone listening, but God is present in you in the act of praying. Opening your heart is an act that has God in it. Being willing to express yourself that way, being willing to share your vulnerability and your needs and your joy, as the psalmist does in so many different ways, that's an act of God. That's an act in which you evoke God's presence. And so it's a different attitude toward prayer. And is that pleasurable, that act? I won't hold it against you if it is, but remember, you're not doing it for the fun of it. Yeah. So that did you enjoy? It's a great question. You realize some of the oddness of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I remember the story, the way you told it at the end is that some other third person comes and says, basically, you're both right.
Yes, I play with the Maggid as an Oriental sage who comes in, he dresses up in an Oriental sage costume.
You made up that part?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Okay, I like it. Okay.
Because so many people learn that only from Eastern religion, that it's all beyond that. There's no difference between my pleasure, God's pleasure, the one pleasure. It's all one pleasure. And sometimes you need to go to an Eastern source to discover that truth, which is a universal truth.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's one and the same. It's the hall of mirrors.
That's
There's no separation. Okay. Okay. Moving on to another topic, creation. You write beautifully and passionately about how making Kiddush on Friday night is the most significant ritual act that is part of your life. Because it's a statement of your faith in divine creation. You also encourage in your book a practice of reciting the Torah's telling of creation, and that we do that.
My students do that every morning after Shacharit. You recite that day of creation. So today I concluded my morning davening with Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created. Tomorrow it will be Yehi Rakia, let there be a firmament, and so on. You go through the 6 days, and on Shabbos you then concluded with Vayechulu Hashemayim Ba'aretz.
Beautiful. So You offer that as part of an environmental consciousness for this time of climate crisis that we're living in and the threat to life on our planet. Could you talk more about what you mean by faith in divine creation and how it might impact how we live on this precarious earth?
So you might not be surprised to know that I'm not a literal believer in creation in 6 days, 5,700 something years ago. I'm not even a believer of, oh, you can take the days of creation and divide them up in their 7 periods or 7 ages or something like that. All of that I find a little bit forced and maybe even juvenile. I accept the account of astrophysicists that the planet is probably 5 or 6 billion years old, and the universe is probably, as we know it, is probably 13 billion years old, and it came out of some great astral explosion, et cetera, that life began the kind of cesspool of chemicals in this planet, and we don't know exactly why. And the evolutionary process begins from there. But I think what it means to believe in creation is to say there is a mystery about this whole thing. We have to see it through the eyes of wonder. That we began with some one-celled creatures under the earth and under the sea, and that they learned to crawl onto dry land, and here we are. And half of them learned to develop arms and legs first, and half of them became plants, and these ate those, and that's how we survived. And finally we got to this thing called human consciousness in that long journey. And we're supposed to say that's not a miracle. Of course it's natural. Of course it's natural. It's natural selection and everything else. But natural selection is incredibly miraculous. I just think we have to learn to see it all with our eyes open, with the eyes of wonder, and see what incredible wonder it is that we exist. You look at the evolutionary process. How did bees and flowers emerge in the same places to pollinate one another? How did that happen? How wise is this natural process called evolution? Now, the question, natural scientists obviously deal with all these questions all the time. Stephen Jay Gould insisted, the great Harvard biologist, that there is no teleology, that there is no purpose or meaning to it all. And I think there he somewhat steps beyond his bounds as a naturalist and makes a philosophical statement. I think there is some mysterious, it is going someplace. I think the tendency of evolution to always seek out both diversity and complexity, to go into more and more complex forms, more and more sophisticated forms, and more diverse forms, new species, new kinds of flowers. Each thing that emerges in this biological journey, I think, is part of the wonder, and that we are a result of that journey toward diversity and complexity. I'm not saying that we are the end product of that, not at all. If we don't destroy this planet, which we very well may do in a few generations, I can imagine a creature 1 million years from now thinking about us as ancestors the way we think of apes as ancestors of human beings, and being as embarrassed by us fools as we are by them, maybe even more so because we almost destroyed the whole cocktail, the whole experiment. But I think this is a journey that is going somewhere. I think it's going somewhere means that the one that exists inside each and every one of these creatures, and the word creatures comes from creation, yes, the one that exists inside every one of these creatures is seeking to reveal itself more and more in new and exciting and different ways. And each of us, each child who's born, is a new revelation of the divine face. And that's an ongoing creative process of which we are a part. And I think that human creativity is a continuum with divine creativity. I think God is creating through us. Now, what AI does to all that, it's an interesting question. Are we at an inflection point in this whole journey? Do we then create the next species rather than procreate the next species? I don't know. But I think so I see creation in that very broad sense. And I think for Jews and Christians, and to some extent Muslims too, we all have, what do we have in common? we have in common. Our revelation stories differ. Yes, we have the Torah, they have Jesus, and the Muslims have the Hijrah and the Quran, but our creation story all goes back to the same story. There is a one that is a creative force in the universe, and I think that's got to inspire us. It's got to become central to our religion in the 21st century because of the terrible urgency of changing our behavior. We are not going to survive as a species if we don't change our behavior drastically. And that means giving up an awful lot of stuff we've gotten comfortable with. The degree of air conditioning. If everybody in India has the same right to air conditioning that we have, then we are really literally cooked. We've got to decide where we're going. And there are tremendous changes are going to be required in the course of the next 100 years and sooner. And how will that happen? We are watching liberal democracy almost collapse in the face of that question because we can't change quickly enough. Too much fossil fuel money behind Senator Manchin and everybody else. And we don't seem to have the public will to make the change. What's going to happen? I'm terrified about that. I really am. And I say the forces of religion, which still govern an awful lot of humanity, have to step forward and help change people's behavior. It has to become a mitzvah in a very real sense of, we are a tiny religious community, as you know, but we have to be there helping to inspire Christians and Muslims and Buddhists who are huge to think about this and to find resources within our spiritual language that will inspire us to live differently. And I think for us, the greatest of those resources is this faith in creation, that there is a divine presence in all this, and that we are dealing not just with physical questions when we talk about plastic and garbage and the pollution of the ocean and all that, but we're dealing with a divine wonder. And how do we protect it? So I'm very involved in that question, and various things like Jewish tree planting groups and things like that. I've always got my name on the list, and those are things I care a whole lot about. But I think creation has to be our language for it.
Yeah, beautiful. And certainly Judaism has so much to offer about how we should be living on this earth. I have a different question for you about what texts we need today. I've been thinking a lot about just the pain and the uncertainty that we're all living with the pandemic and awakening about racial injustice and climate crisis and democracy, so many things. And I think a lot about, like, what do I want to teach? Like, what are the sources that not only tell us what the right way to live to heal our planet is, but what are the teachings that really speak to the pain and the uncertainty that we've been living with? And I'm wondering if you have any favorite teachings that have been providing you with, I don't know, comfort or inspiration over this last year and a half or so. And while you're thinking about that, I'll just add on a part 2 to that. Maybe that'll help you, because I know I've been drawing a blank. I'm like, oh, what is the Torah for this moment? You're the biographer of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. Your dissertation became a book about him. And, he was someone who struggled with depression and had a hard life. And yet all of his teachings are, mitzvah gedola liot b'simcha tamid. Like, it's a great mitzvah to be happy always. And I guess I'm wondering, is there anything in Rabbi Nachman that is wisdom for us today? I mean, I'm curious how you understand his psychology and, how someone who struggled so much would have this message of, don't despair, don't despair. How do you understand his inner world? And, is that one of the teachings we need for today? I don't know. I'm thinking out loud here. I'd love to know. That's part 2. So part 1 and part 2, whatever you want to answer.
I'll give you 3 answers to part 1 and part 2.
Okay.
The line I thought about all year, all through the pandemic in davening was Barech Aleinu Adonai Eloheinu et hashana hazot letovah. Bless this year for us, for good. What good is going to come out of this year? There's got to be some good that comes out of this year. Instead of just saying, let it be over, Let's go on to next year. You know, Tichlesh Shana V'Kil Lotah. I said, Barech Alenu Tashana Azot L'Tova. Let's what's going to come out of this year. So I look around. You're all wearing masks. We dared to take ours off for today, but maybe that's going to be preparation for us when we all have to wear masks because of climate change. Maybe many of us, not all of us, of course, have learned that we have to be willing to do some radical things to change our behavior. And maybe this pandemic will turn out to have been a blessing that way, that we can change our behavior, we can socially distance, and therefore maybe we can also stop drinking water out of plastic bottles, or whatever the next thing will be, et cetera, in more drastic ways, that we have to change our behavior if we are going to survive, and many of us have learned to do that. So maybe there's some blessing that comes out of this very tough year we've been through, if we take it that way. That's number one. That's answer number one. Number two, yesterday somebody asked me, what's my favorite line in the Mishnah? I'm not a Mishnah person particularly. I don't spend a lot of time studying Mishnah. I study Hasidut much more, but I said, there's the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, which says, why was only a single person created? Why was only one Adam created? So nobody would say, my father was greater than your father. That's Judaism at its most universalistic. We have a Judaism that's also very tribal. And we know about the tribal quality and our difficulty with the tribal quality. And then you get into chosenness. And then you get into all the Israelis, who believe there is no God, but we're the chosen people anyway, and et cetera. So that Vamad Nivra Adam Yechidi, why was only one person created? So nobody can say my father is greater than yours. That transcends all the racial differences and all the ethnic differences and all the tribal loyalties we have. And then it says, the Mishnah goes on to say, this shows the greatness of God, that a king stamps all his coins in the same press and they all come out alike. But God stamped us all in the press of Adam, Eve, and no two human beings are alike. And each of us is a unique divine image. And I think that's Judaism's most essential moral teaching. So that when, in all the racial issues we're dealing with, I mean, I have many readers in Israel. I have 5 or 6 books out in Hebrew, and I probably have more serious readers in Israel than I do here these days. And I spend every winter in Israel. I hope to be going the end of December if they open the skies. And I just tried to contact the Israeli consulate this morning and they're not answering. So we'll see. But it's very important to me to have some influence on Israel. And I just lost the train of thought. And the uniqueness of every person, yes. Okay. And so in these years, this year that we've been going through this racial stuff, I've been saying to Israelis, look, learn from us. America was built on these 2 terrible original sins, what we did to the native population and the importation of slaves. And we've never overcome the moral stain of those 2 sins. Look, these things are not forgotten. You've got to deal with the Palestinian issue in a more whole and generous way. We have won. We are the victors. What a good victor does is treat the defeated generously and openly. And we have not been able to do that yet. Forgive me for getting political, but we've not been able to do that yet. And learn from America that if you don't do it later, it will still be biting you 200 years from now. And America has to learn that still and say, how do we get out of that constantly being bitten by it, and constantly, every time we try to raise our moral voice about anything now, the Chinese are there saying, what about Jim Crow? And we don't have much to say. What about the Native Americans? We don't have much to say. And that's the great moral stain on this society. And we have to find a way to deal with it. And that will mean reparations. It will mean something like the Truth and Reconciliation that South Africa went through, and opening it up in very painful ways. But I think that's going to happen. I mean, you could say that in Berkeley and get away with it, I know.
Oh, yeah.
They don't invite me much to Oshkosh, so it's okay.
Yeah. And did you want to say anything about Rabbi Nachman and
Rabbi
his
Nachman,
wisdom?
yes, the third one was Rabbi
Yeah.
Nachman. I grabbed the Rabbi Nachman book,
Okay.
okay?
All right. Yeah. And they want the microphone closer to your mouth.
Okay. So I'll just read you the last line in the biography here. Rabbi Nachman died in 1810. Emanuel Ringelblum's diary of the life of the Warsaw Ghetto contains the following brief note in the entry for February 19th, 1941. In the prayer house of the Hasidim from Wrocław on Novolipia Street, there's still a large sign, Eden seid sich nicht miyaish, Jews never despair. The Hasidim danced there with the same religious fervor as they did before the war. We need that sign in our Beit Midrash too. And we need to dance with that same fervor and not give up. There are lots of things we could give up on. The survival of the planet, the survival of the country, the survival of Israel, lots of things we care about that it would be easy to give up on. And that's not an alternative. Despair is not an alternative. And therefore be happy always. And dance around the despair and force. He says somewhere else, there's a wonderful line. There's a line in the Psalms. How do I translate this? Sason v'simcha yasigu v'nasu yagon v'anacha. Joy and gladness catch up while pain and mourning run away. He says sometimes you're like a person in a dance hall and there are wallflowers standing along the wall. The pain and suffering is standing along the wall while you try to dance. You don't ignore them, you have to grab them and force them into the circle of dancing with you, because they too have to become part of the dance. So bring that wallflower within you, and make it part of the dance too, because otherwise you're going to collapse. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So yes, sometimes you have to force yourself to be happy, and that's good too. Force ourselves into hope. Hope is a defiance of absurdity. It's not a denial of absurdity. Absurdity is possibly real, but we have to spit in its face. We have to defy it, and go on living and hoping. That's
Okay.
A good message to take a breather on.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Well, you brought up a few moments ago what Israeli Jews have to learn from us. In one area, you were talking about politics more. I was intrigued by your chapter. One chapter in the book is a letter, Dear Brothers and Sisters, I think it is, a letter to Israeli Jews. And you explained something I found really helpful. You talk about American Jews being post-1780 Enlightenment Jews, asking the question, how is Judaism meaningful? Whereas Israeli Jews are post-1933 Jews, that's how you describe it, asking, how are we going to survive? And I thought
they're trying to kill us all. How will we survive?
Right.
Is the Israeli question. Yeah.
So just different questions that kind of guide our different approaches to life. And but in the end, you invite Israelis to learn something from us. And so could you just talk a little bit about, obviously you've chosen to make your career here in the diaspora in America. What do you think Israeli Jews have to learn from us? Not also just about politics, but about Judaism.
I think the 1780 question was hidden for Israelis for a long time because of the 1933 question. The question that Israel was founded on, they're trying to kill us, how will we survive? And the Israeli governments, especially the right-wing governments, encourage that question. That's it. It's all about Jewish survival. Take those kids to see Auschwitz, and remind them that our enemies are trying to destroy us. And therefore, the post-1780 question, how does a Jew live in the modern world? And what does Judaism have to say to people who live in the modern world? Was put aside in Israel. Everybody was in their own camp. Orthodox answers, secular answers. Are you dati or lo dati? Are you religious or secular? And And the Reform and Conservative didn't matter. They were tiny foreign imports. And that's the way it was. But now I think I begin to see, I go every year, and I've been going for many, many years. I don't know if I've made 30 or 40 trips to Israel. It's been many, many times. And now I spend every winter there, if I can. And I see a new Israeli Judaism emerging. It's coming from two groups. It's coming from former Orthodox people who are walking away from it and looking for an alternative. And there are many thousands of them. Former Haredi people coming out of Mea Sharim, who are leaving it behind and looking for an answer. People coming out of the modern Orthodox world who are no longer there. They're called in Hebrew Datlashim, Datiyim L'Shavar, former Orthodox. And there are many secular Israelis who, in the course of their post-army journey to India or Burma or the forests of South America, have discovered a kind of spirituality against which they didn't have antibodies because it wasn't Dati spirituality. It wasn't Jewish Orthodox spirituality that was trying to convert them. And so they come back sort of seekers, looking for something. Some of them just open yoga studios in Tel Aviv or Los Angeles or Miami or Berlin and speak Hebrew and eat hummus, and that's it. But some of them are looking for something else. A few become Bratslav Hasidim or Chabadniks. But there are a lot of them who are looking for a different kind of Judaism. And those two groups are beginning to meet and create something different. My dear friend, Rabbi Tamar Elad Applebaum was a leader of that group, a kind of an emerging new Judaism, which is a combination of some Hasidic teaching, some Sephardic melodies, some old Zionist favorites. They sing Bialek Hachamami Rosh Ilanot at their Friday night service as part of the liturgy, and Ahavat Eretz Yisrael, the love of the land and the love of the Hebrew language, and a kind of very strongly ethical spirituality. I can see it beginning to emerge. And I think Israel is going to have to face that post-1780 question, because plenty of people are asking, why do I live here? Why am I an Israeli? And why do I want to risk my sons going into the army? What am I fighting for? Am I fighting for the survival of this country, or am I fighting for the settlements that I don't believe in? Why am I risking my children's lives? Why do I live here? I can live a very comfortable life in Berlin. Lots of Israelis now have second passports because they came from European Union countries, and it's easier to travel, so you have a European Union passport. And that's also a just-in-case card. Just in case there's some terrible calamity here, or just in case this place becomes so terribly racist I can't stand living here anymore. I hear that from secular Israelis. And so I think that what does this all mean to us is something that Israelis are going to have to be asking more and more. Not a few Israelis coming back from their journey to South America or wherever come back with a spouse who's not Jewish. And then, should I convert to Judaism? Should our children be raised as Jews? And then therefore be subject to the Israeli army, etc.? Do I want to do that? Those questions are becoming real. And so I think that the time has come for Israelis to deal with that. And that's why I work so hard to have my books translated into Hebrew. This new book is just, the translation was just completed this month. And it will come out next year. Yediot will put it out next year in Hebrew. It's called the Shem Yichud in Hebrew. And I participate very actively in that translation process along with the translator. And so it's trying to influence that process.
Nice. Okay, I have a couple more questions, and then I want to give you all an opportunity to ask some questions. So you have guided generations of seekers and rabbinical students in their learning. I'm curious, in your decades, what evolution have you seen in Jewish seekers and what they're seeking? Have your students changed? Have your students influenced your own thought and your own teaching? And just given all the changes in our world today, in this very challenging time that we're living in, the rabbis of the future, you've been engaged in training future generations of rabbis for a long time. What is the spiritual curriculum for the rabbis of the future at this time? I know there were a lot of questions in there, but just some reflections about your students over the years and the reality that they've lived in and what the reality is now.
Great question, very important question. I first became a theologian when I was teaching undergraduates at the University of Pennsylvania. And I looked around at them. These were all fourth and fifth generation Jewish kids, which is to say their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents were the immigrants to America. I am the Jew I am because I had East European grandparents, and I grew up with a Yiddish newspaper on the table and stories about the old country. My grandparents immigrated to America the first decade of the 20th century, but they still lived in memory of this is the way we did it in Daheim, back home. And I saw that Yiddish newspaper. I took high school German in order to learn Yiddish, and et cetera, et cetera. I looked at these kids and I said, they don't have any of that memory. Their grandparents were already born in Brooklyn or Philadelphia or Baltimore. They didn't have East European memories. Why? And they don't know anything about anti-Semitism. Why should they remain Jewish? What will keep them Jewish? And then I said, it's time to start thinking about, is there a Jewish future? Not just about studying the past. And then I began writing my sort of personal journey books instead of just historical books like Rabbi Nachman. So I've been involved in that question for a long time. The rabbinical students I teach today were born after the Second Intifada. Not only don't they remember Israel before 67, they don't remember Israel before 92. And therefore, for them, Israel has always been a very successful, conquering country. They never don't remember. I remember being in Jerusalem where the barbed wire was in the middle of the street, and that the other half of Jerusalem was Jordanian territory. And of course, that's completely gone to them. I remember my mother and grandmother sitting with lists of surviving people in the DP camps in 47, 48, and going through the lists and trying to find names of relatives. So I know what Israel was needed for. It's in my blood what Israel was needed for, because I saw Jewish survivors after the war. There were plenty of them in Newark, New Jersey, where I grew up. And that's, of course, just an historic memory to our students. So there's been a decline in that sense of Jewish peoplehood and the urgency of Jewish survival. The other side, the 1933 side, they don't experience that, is the Jewish people going to survive urgency? The way those of us who remember the Holocaust and remember the Soviet Jewry campaign and so on do. They don't know Jews oppressed anywhere for the crime of being Jewish. And so it's harder, that's harder. Of course, other things have changed too. The tremendous growth, needless to say, of women's participation. When I went to rabbinical school, we were all guys. And women's participation and second wave feminism was very strong. When I was at RRC, groups of students who wanted to be called witches because those were empowered spiritual women, et cetera, et cetera. That's all somewhat history, but somewhat there in the background too. What exactly is a woman rabbi's role and a woman's spiritual role in Judaism? Does it work for a woman to become a rabbi the same way men are rabbis? And how do we change it? I think the fact that more than 50% of my students are women, about 55, 60% are women, is very important. I think women have done a lot to make the rabbinate more a caring profession, more about caring for people and caring for families and so on, and that's been a great addition. Some women, I think you're among them, have also really entered into the classic rabbinic textual tradition, but some women feel alienated from it because it was all written by men for male readers, and they never quite find their way into it. And that unfortunately shapes their rabbinate as not being about that. So I think that's an issue we have to deal with. Nowadays, we have a large percentage of various sorts of genderqueer people applied to rabbinical school. And the question of whether the Jewish community is ready for them is something we don't know yet. I worry about students who want to be rabbis and are somehow unconventional gender, and I don't mean just gay or lesbian, but I mean more obviously unconventional, trans, and so on, etc. Gender-wise, and is the community ready for them?
We are here in Berkeley. But
I understand this is, but this is
yeah.
Berkeley. There aren't a lot of rabbinic jobs in Berkeley. Is Beth Israel and Oshkosh ready for that? I'm not sure. And that's an issue I worry about. Because Israel has always been powerful as far as they're concerned, they're very upset about the condition of the Palestinians and the lack of resolution. And we have some protests about that. So all those things are going on. I also want to say that the most serious rabbinical students are taking observance very seriously. There's a new movement toward more serious consideration of halakha and observance. An institution called Hadar is very much at the center of that. And Hadar reinforces that, and many of our people have studied that Hadar and Pardes, which are places that really enforce a kind of rigorous attachment to Jewish practice and Jewish law. And that, I think, has grown. When I think 30 years ago, there was less of that. And I would say taking tradition and observance and even legal formulations of it more seriously is something that's happening not among all, but among quite a few of the most serious rabbinical students. I think the rabbinic leadership in the next generation will be quite serious about that, and how they will contend with congregants who don't care about it is an ongoing issue. As you know, in the conservative movement, it's always been the case that there are conservative rabbis in synagogues and not many conservative Jews. Not many people in the conservative synagogues who really observe what conservative Judaism is supposed to stand for, and how that will survive and how that tension will work out. I think JTS and Hadar and our more traditional people all have to struggle with. But the commitment on the part of those people to observance is very strong. Yeah. And some of my rabbinical students ask, how will I ever take a congregation in a place where I can't daven?
Right. I mean, all those are really interesting questions. I also just wonder about how the Jewish organizational world is changing so rapidly. I mean, even during this pandemic, we have no idea what Jewish institutions and synagogues are going to look like in the coming years. And
Right.
with climate chaos and our whole reality changing so much, we really feel it here in the Bay Area because we deal with wildfires and air
Yes.
quality, and
Mhm.
it's very real to us. And
Mhm.
I know that sometimes it's hard to even imagine what the future is going to look like. And I just think about rabbinical students now and wondering what they're being prepared for in terms of going into the unknown, and if that's something that you all talk about.
I want to say that I have a whole lot of rabbinical students, some of my very best, who really want to do careers in adult Jewish education.
Mhm.
They don't want to be congregational rabbis. They don't want to be Hebrew school principals. They want to teach adults. And there aren't good frameworks for jobs to do that.
Mhm.
What do they do? I had a conversation yesterday with my old friends David and Rachel Beal, who have revived the Lehr House here in the Bay Area, which I think is terrific.
Mhm.
Trying to think, is that a model that people could create other places? I think if the synagogue is going to survive, it will have to be as much a Beit Midrash as it is a Beit Tfilah. And how will we bring serious adult learning back into the Jewish community?
Yeah.
And that's a big piece of what these young rabbis are anxious to do it, and they don't know, can I really make a living at Jewish adult education, and who pays that salary, and where do I apply for that job, and so on.
Yeah.
Of course, needless to say, many of the most interesting congregations in America today are shtibluch created by rabbis around their own vision. You look at Ikar in Los Angeles and Romamu in New York, etc., and many other, about a dozen other places like that. And those are rabbi-created synagogues, and that's a model that may grow. And some of these people, if they have, not everybody can do that, but some people of these may go out and try to create their own nuclei of synagogues.
Yeah. Okay, let me give you all who've been sitting so politely a chance to say some things. Does anybody have a question out there? Let's see. Would it be okay if I brought this microphone? It might be easier just to have you talk right into it so that people on Zoom can hear.
Thank you for, my name is Karen. Yeah, thank you for a wonderful, informative talk, and I want to read all your books now. I also want to say I was also a Brandeis student, took class with Nahum Glotzer, and that was my favorite teacher. Absolutely mesmerizing. But I have a question. You mentioned something that I've heard many other people say, that God is, the individual person reflects God. And I have a big problem with that, because what do you do with individual people who are evil, or multiple people who are evil? Where is that in the concept of God?
Yes, it's one of the big questions, of course. We cannot say that there is any human being who doesn't have a divine spark in them. I don't think I can say that some people do and some people don't, because then I'll say, well, then we have to have a devil who created the bad people. God created the good people and the demon created the bad people. And I'm not a dualist, I'm a monist. I believe there's only one. I believe we all come from the same place. So I say that there's such a thing as, in Hebrew, the word is klipot, shells that people build around themselves and hide the spark. And those klipot are mostly defenses. Those klipot are those shells we build around ourselves are mostly defenses we build up in our childhood. Why did Hitler hate Jews? You know, because he had some kind of fears as a child or insecurities as a young person. He built up harder, higher and higher walls around himself, and they became indeed demonic. But that's not to say there wasn't a divine spark in that human being. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't fight that person. You should fight that person and kill that person if they become evil enough. I'm not an absolute pacifist, but I do say that yes, the spark is in every person, and our job is to try to help the person discover that spark and bring down those walls as best we can. But when that person does evil and acts evil, we have to stand up against them and defy evil too.
Jonah, I really relate to your story of being raised secular, becoming more religious later in life. And I'm wondering how you make halachic observance and this non-dual theology, which is kind of a lot to explain to someone. You know, when a friend or a parent who is not religious asks you, why are you doing all this wild stuff now? And in my mind, there's all this non-dual theology behind it, but that's not a quick, snappy response. So I'm wondering how you can sum that up in like a, why am I laying to fill in?
The elevator speech.
I do not have an elevator speech for you. I did not succeed in convincing my atheist father. He loved the book on Rabbi Nachman of Wroclaw because it was history and he was a historian. But then when I started writing theology, he said, "You don't believe that stuff, do you?" He just didn't get it at all. And there are people who will never get it. And you have to accept sometimes there are people who will never get it. There are people for whom you can find a language to say it, and there are people who just will not get it, and that's it. I believe that all these observances are human creations. I do not know a God who commands me to put on tefillin and not to eat that cheeseburger. I think these are all human institutions. But these are our ways of expressing the fullness of our heart, the longings of our heart. The spiritual life is contained in ritual forms. And the ritual forms over the years have proven themselves to work for me. They work for me. I struggled a long time against them. It took me a long time to say, this is really the way I want to live, and I love it. And I'm happy living this way, and I'm fulfilled living this way. And this is how I say it in Jewish. This is the ritual language that I speak to say the things, the spiritual things I need to say. My Aunt Ruth always used to ask, how do you say it in Jewish? Of course, she meant in Yiddish. But this is how we say it in Jewish. And this is how we choose to live. And this is the religious language of our people. And I use it to express what I need to express.
If I could quote something from your book that I think beautifully says the answer to that question in one sentence, I highlighted it. To be a religious person is to perceive that we exist in a world infused with divinity and to live in response to that awareness. Beautiful.
And those ritual forms are part of how we live in response. Yeah.
I want to give people on Zoom, there's a lot of people on Zoom, and if anybody wants to put something in the chat and I can try to transmit your questions from the chat, oh gosh, okay. Here we go. Question, please, you know what, let me do another one so I need a little time to see what I'm looking at. Let's do another question from somebody in the room.
Thank you so much for sharing really inspiring thoughts. I wanted to ask you about prayer because the way you talk about it is very inspiring, but my experience of Jewish prayer personally is that it's like reading a series of dense texts that there isn't even time to read them. in this time of the service with any attempt to comprehend, or, you can read them as like, I'm just mumbling through these words and it's a mantra, or you can read them and say, I've decided this is the little nugget that I'm going to think about every day when I read this paragraph, and I'm switching that on, or, but I don't know whether it's a historical accretion of, like we're still praying for the exilarch's health, like it's just so much and so long. And I mean, sometimes I just can tune out, but I just wonder what you do with that. I've heard some people say, as a devotion, I would read the phone book. If that's what God says I'm going to read, then that's what I'm going to read. But I'm just curious what you do with that form that prayer takes in Judaism.
Yes, that's the Yeshaya Leibovich approach. God told me to read the phone book. I'd read the phone book. No, that's not me. Yes, take your time with it. Nobody's standing over you and saying you have to do the whole thing. Find a phrase. Yachid Chaya Olamim. Single one life of all the worlds. Find a phrase. Hamechadesh b'tuvo b'chol yom tamid maseh bereshit. God in goodness renews creation every day. And stay with it for 5 minutes. Close your eyes and stay with it for 5 minutes. Chant it over and over. Call HaNeshama to Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Every breath praises God, Hallelujah. And just take your time with it. Close your eyes and take your time with it. Nobody's counting to see how many of those words you said. The synagogue is going on with its thing. You do your thing. And do it at home, not just in shul. I find my weekday davening is better at home, better alone, where I do things at my pace, in my way. And on Shabbos, I do it with a minyan. Well, I grew up in my grandfather's shul, so I can mumble with the best of them. But my grandfather and I used to sit there and laugh at Mr. Leimitz, who sat next to us, who said Ein Keloheinu instead of Ein Keloheinu, because he was a Galiciano and we were Litvaks. I grew up still in that world. But do it your own way. Do it at home. Melochol aretz kivodo. The whole earth is filled with His glory. What more do you need to say? And if it takes you 20 minutes to say that, you have davened probably a lot better than your neighbor who has mumbled through the whole thing. So use it. Think of the Siddur as an anthology, and you have some favorite poems in that anthology that you turn to. And don't feel yourself obligated to complete the whole thing. When that's just self-defeating. Yeah.
Any other questions in the room? I'll get you next. Is that Ms. Ellie Shabbat?
Hello, so good to see you here. I heard you say, I think the word was Panentheism, and that God, Ruach, Spark, is in everything. And I also hear your devotion to the environment. Can you speak about God in plastic and toxic waste and the things that seem to be squelching God and our future on the planet?
The chant we started off with was Ein od milvado. There's nothing but God. So what's plastic? Good question.
You remember The Graduate, the one word to say to you, plastics. So yes, God is in plastics. God is in the plastic business. And God is in the elastic business, making you more elastic, making us more elastic. Yes, God is in everything. And when we dump that plastic waste in the ocean, we are dumping God into God. And we are hurting the divine self. The Hasidic Rebbe named the Ishbitzer, whom Shlomo Carlebach used to quote a lot, whom others quoted a lot, he says on the verse, Kedoshim tiyu ki kadosh ani Hashem Elohechem, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. He says, that's not a commandment, it's a statement. You are holy because I, God, am holy, and I live inside you. He says, Bevakasha mikem al tivi'uni limkomotem metunafim. Please, don't take me to those contaminated places. It hurts me to go there.
And I also think about was it Kedushat Levy that talked about the the world of ayin and the world of yesh. Like on one level, it's all God, but we live in the world of stuff. And there's holy and not holy here in this world too. I keep losing this. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Sheila. And I first met Rabbi Green at a Chavurah Institute maybe 50 years ago. That was very, very formative and exciting. So I thank you for that. Anyway, just one comment first about enjoying the service. The first time I encountered an Orthodox invitation to a bar mitzvah, I was shocked because it was, please join us in the Ol HaBar Mitzvah and the acceptance of the burden of the mitzvot. I was like coming from the conservative Jewish movement. Okay, but my
Talk
question.
into the microphone so people.
My question is, how do you, since Judaism is an anti-dualistic religion, how do you understand both that God is immanent and transcendent, away from nature? And
Yes, I don't think those are two different aspects. I think transcendence, which means a God we don't fully understand, I think transcendence lives within immanence. God is so fully present in this moment that we will never penetrate to that depth. That's the transcendence, that's the mystery. The transcendence, if you want the technical term, the transcendence is epistemological. It's transcendent to our mind, transcendent to our awareness. It's not that God lives outside the universe on the other side of the heavens. There is no other side of cosmic space. There is nothing beyond space. It's not that God is beyond space. It's that God is beyond comprehension. And so it's the one that is present in all things, that is also beyond comprehensibility in all things. And that's the transcendence, that's the over there. It's the over there from our awareness that's deeper than our awareness, not the over there like someplace else.
So apparently there's 100 or so people on Zoom, and a couple of questions came in about the soul. One is, how do we take the essence of our Jewish soul to the world? And the other question, I think that relates to soul as well, is what about non-human creatures? Where do they fit in?
How do we take our message to the world? How do we take our Jewish soul to the world? I think we still have something to give. You know, we live in an incredible age, and you in Berkeley probably see it more than people in some places do. We live in a world of openness between religions. Jews never knew what Eastern religion was until the last 40 years. We had never met Hindus and Buddhists and Taoists and Zen Buddhists and so on. That's all new. It's a new encounter for us. And now, of course, so many thousands of Jews have flocked to Eastern religions because they found nothing of value in Judaism, which breaks my heart because I have found so much in Judaism. And the question is, what do we still have to say to the world? So I think we should be open. We should be involved in interfaith dialogue in a very spiritually open-minded way. What do we have to learn from interfaith dialogue? And what do we have to give? We have things to learn. Bringing meditation back into Judaism, bringing silence back into our service is a great gift. There were old forms of Jewish meditation that were long neglected. And now you find Jewish meditation classes and institutes. You find synagogues that have yoga classes. I think that's all great. That's import. That's the import side. How about the export side? What do we have to do? What do we have to give the world? I would begin with, I have a little book called Judaism's 10 Best Ideas, which is my basic intro to intro book, my door opener book. That's not in your group. You don't have that one, I guess.
I didn't bring all of them.
I mean, that's not for you.
I have read it though,
Right.
yes.
That's a book not for you. That's a book to give out to.
Yes.
That's a book to give out as a bar mitzvah gift.
I
or
gave that one away.
to give to your child who's going. That's a book to give to your child who's going off to college, who says she's an atheist, or your daughter-in-law who's thinking about converting, or something like that. It's a door opener book. But I would begin, first of all, Shabbat, I think is a very valuable thing that we still have to give to the world. The idea that once a week you get off the treadmill and stop. You know, the Torah only forbids two kinds of labor on Shabbat, lighting fires and gathering sticks. That's what work was in the Stone Age. I say in the digital age, put away the wallet and turn off the screen. Those are the two things that would make a Shabbat for us. I have there 10 instructions for a contemporary Shabbat. You can see in several of my books. I think, and that's we live in an age of such speeding up of consciousness that getting off the treadmill is a terribly important thing, and that we have that in our tradition, I think is something we should be sharing in the world. Years ago, I stopped saying that passage in the Shabbat morning service that says, you did not give Shabbat to the heathens, only to the Jews. I believe we should be giving it to the world. That's number one. Number two is this sense of Tselem Elohim, the sense that every person is a unique divine image, is a terribly important spiritual message, spiritual and ethical at once. It doesn't resolve all the questions. What to do about abortion and what to do about end of life is not answered by saying every person is a divine image. Some people will say, therefore, I should be anti-abortion. Some people say, therefore, I should allow for the extinction of life when a person has no more consciousness. I'm not answering those questions, but they have to be dealt with around the framework of every human being as the image of God. And to teach people that and realize that just doing it for convenience or unthinkingly is not the answer. So I think those things are both pieces of what we have to give to the world, and I think we should be involved still in trying to communicate to the world that the Jewish sense of tikkun olam, the Jewish sense that the world is an improvable and repairable place, that sense of hope. I think that's why we're here. I think we exist for the sake of that. We don't exist just to be a cute ethnic minority with matzah balls and gefilte fish. We exist because we have something to say.
Beautiful. Hang on to that. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Sorry, I'll look at this. Marcia.
Not finding spirituality in American synagogues was a very big problem, and people are working on it. I probably never gotten active in Judaism if I hadn't gone to the Aquarian Minyan, which a number of people here have told me was their spiritual step back into Judaism. And then Kehila, founded by your friend Bert Jacobson. And then we had Chochmat Lev. Now we have another whole generation of Urban Adamah, Wilderness Torah, Eden Village Camp. So my question for you is, do you feel like those are really transmitting a valid, valuable Judaism?
Have you been to all of those places?
I've been to Urban Adamah. I know both Adam and Zelig, and I think very highly of them. I think they're doing wonderful things. They're speaking the language of a generation that I don't speak very well. Listen, they're especially Urban Adamah is conveying the Jewish and environmental messages together, and I care greatly about that, and I'm delighted he's doing that. And he came out of course, Adamah in Connecticut, in Isabella Friedman and so on, where I visit frequently and I've had a lot of contact with Chazon and so on. So I'm very close to all those circles. Yes, we let 1,000 flowers bloom. Yes, we need all kinds of different new institutions. Some old institutions will survive and learn to change and learn to renew themselves and bring young people in, and some will create new institutions for a new generation and new forms of Judaism. That's all great. I was shocked to learn that my friend Bert's little creation has 550 families. That was a little intimate chavurah at one time. And I'm shocked that Chavurat Shalom, which we created in 1968, still exists in that old house in Somerville, Mass. And now has only maybe 30 members, 30, 40 members, but they have carried on. And I'm sorry? Yes, of course. And I inhabit a new institution inside an old one. Hebrew College is now celebrating its 100th anniversary. It was founded in 1921 to train teachers for the Hebrew schools in Boston, but it's now become a rabbinical school, or now has a rabbinical school at its center, which is a new institution. So it's a new sort of re-inhabiting the old. So all of these models are possible, and let them all come. History will decide which models survive, but trying things, experimenting. We have daily tefillah in our rabbinical school, and students do different things, and we have very traditional, and we have neo-Hasidic, and we have reform services, and we have meditation services, and sometimes students do things I can't stand. Sometimes students do experimental things that are really not for me, and somebody says to me, "Why do you let that happen?" And I say, because I don't know the future. They're going to be here 50 years from now, and they're going to be leading, and maybe that's the form that will survive, and not my form. And I'm willing to say, let's try all kinds of things and see where we go.
So we are coming to the end of our time in just a moment, and I want to ask two last things to kind of help us wrap up, and then Rabbi Green will be available to sign books. You have to buy the books first, and then we'll be signing books. The books you can buy in the back there, and then he's going to be up here. Okay, and you'll stay here and sign the books here. But just two things to wrap up. First, we've talked a lot about your book, Judaism for the World, but you also have a new book that I just bought. Ooh, and look forward to reading.
867 pages.
Wow, it's going to take me a while, but I think maybe it's arranged by Parsha, right? So I can just do a little at a time. Okay, so could you just tell us a little bit about Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Chernobyl and just what you're excited about with this book?
I've spent my life studying the early Hasidic classics, the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and his immediate disciples, and I have been teaching that to generations of seekers and rabbinical students and so on. Of the early books of Hasidism, this is my very favorite. The Rabbi of Chernobyl was faithful to the Baal Shem Tov's message that all of life is a form of devotion, that you could find the presence of God everywhere, and he reads the entire Torah as related to the spiritual journey. He takes every verse in the Torah and tries to see, how does it relate to our spiritual lives today? Now, he's writing in the 18th century. So it's not the same as our lives today, but he's the model. He's a model of how to do that. It's Judaism as a spiritual path laid out following the parsha of each week. And he's been an inspiration to me. Now I'm writing my own sort of neo-Hasidic divrei Torah for our age, but in some ways inspired by what he did. So to see a Judaism sort of laid out as a spiritual path, the Morinayim is very beautiful. I was with a dear friend last night. She's got hundreds of little stickers in the pages that because she's using to teach it. And so that's the Morinayim. He was the Rabbi of Chernobyl. He died in 1797. He had a son who took over for him, but that son had 8 sons, and each one became a rabbi in a different town. They all took the family name of Twersky, and all the various Hasidic Rebbes were the Twerskys, the Tolner Rebbes and the Triska Rebbes and the Rachmas Rivka Rebbes and the Herna Stapler Rebbes and the this Rebbes and that Rebbes, all named Twersky, were his descendants. And they and one other family, the Friedmans, more or less ruled Jewish life in the Ukraine for 100 years. So if you have Ukrainian Jewish ancestors, you might be interested too in seeing what their spiritual life was about.
Okay, and the final question to just wrap us up. You have a chapter in Judaism for the World about it's called Jewish Mysticism and its Healing Power. And you do share personally in your book about losing your mom at an early age, at age 11, and your own spiritual seeking. And so I would just love it for a closing comment, how you find healing power, not in a magical way, not in the just buy a book and put it on your shelf and it'll somehow heal everything that's, cure your ailments, but how do you find healing through these mystical texts that you've devoted your life to teaching?
Yeah. I had to learn the distinction between curing and healing. Some people say, if you have an amulet from this such and such a Rebbe or his picture in your Jerusalem taxi cab or in your market stall, it will cure your illness. It will protect you from dangers. And I don't believe in that kind of efficacy of religious teachings. I'm not superstitious in that sense. So it's not about curing. I don't believe it cures cancer, but it heals. It heals as in making us more whole and making us more accepting. And all of our lives will end at some point, and an 80-year-old feels that very clearly. And coming to terms with what we have done with our lives and where we go with our lives and what we are leaving behind, all those are being at peace with all those things are what healing is about. And the beauty of the teachings has been enriching to me over the course of this whole journey. And so it's the beauty of understanding, the beauty of awareness, that for me in some ways has been a healing factor through a lot of loss and a lot of experience of life. I'm a widower for the last 4 years. My wife suffered very severe Parkinson's for years before that, and we went through some hard time together. And the beauty of these teachings and the richness of this vision was something we both turned back to a great deal, and it has in that sense a lot of healing power. And I wish you all well with it. Thank you.
Amen. Absolutely. Your teaching and the teachings that you have brought out into the world, I absolutely feel have been healing for me and for so many. So just want to thank you for your work and offer you continued blessings for continuing to share your Torah with the world. And so we will close maybe with the same nigun that we started with, and people are welcome to go purchase books and come up to have them signed. Thank you so much. Yasher Koch, thank you so much, so much.
Thanks to you for great questions and a really great spirit of dialogue. Much appreciated. Really.
Oh, my absolute pleasure and honor. Thank you. Okay. Here's your watch. The table's a little wobbly.